Okay, so for today, we're going to be talking about fluids, particularly fluids in a biological space. We're going to talk about some electrolytes, some non-electrolytes, and how they are regulated in the body. So just to start off, um, particularly in the human body, a lot of people know blood as one of the major fluids that we deal with. So we deal with blood a lot. That's the principal fluid that flows all around our body. But that's not to say that's the only body fluid. There's also lymph. We also have a lot of interstitial fluid. And there's even more. Like we can even maybe bring in cerebrospinal fluid, which we find in the spinal cord. So there's fluids all around. A large percentage of our body can actually be classed as fluids, particularly water. So fluids that are in our body system are composed of water. You can also find things like electrolytes, and then we also have non-electrolytes. We even have things like cells that circulates particularly in the blood, and there's so much more. But then just going into the definition of electrolytes and non-electrolytes, we can say that an electrolyte is something, or let's start with the non-electrolytes actually. So the non-electrolytes, these are things that do not dissociate. So we can say they do not dissociate. And by that, I'm just referring to the fact that when you put something that is a non-electrolyte in water, it will not dissolve to break down into smaller ions. So for example, if we have something like glucose, C6H12O6, and you put that in water, it won't break down. To break down, it won't produce like any particular ions. It'll just be still C6H12O6 because it's a ring structure. So it doesn't really break down. Even when it's in its branch structure, it still wouldn't break down. This is as opposed to an actual electrolyte. And an actual electrolyte is something that will dissociate. So let's say an actual electrolyte. An actual electrolyte will dissociate to produce component ions. For example, NaCl, which is sodium chloride. If you have solid sodium chloride or solid table salt, that will break down to produce the component ions of sodium plus and then Cl minus. These are smaller components that we call ions because they carry a charge. Sodium carries a positive charge, chlorine carries a negative charge. So sodium carrying a positive charge is the cation, and then chlorine is the anion because it is negatively charged. So we deal with a lot of electrolytes in our body, and we also deal with a lot of non-electrolytes. As I mentioned before, glucose is an example of a non-electrolyte, but that's not the only non-electrolyte that we deal with. Here are some common non-electrolyte examples. Because a lot of large biological compounds or structures can be classed as non-electrolytes because they don't break down to produce ions particularly. But some include glucose. You also have urea, which is a common waste product. And then like a lot of lipids are also non-electrolytes because they do not really ionize. And there's just many more biological organic compounds that do not break down. So we call those non-electrolytes. And then here are some major electrolytes. So things that we actually see breaking down. We talk about major electrolytes in terms of the cations and anions that we see circulating in the body. So some common cations. So let's start with cations. The major cations that we deal with in the body are sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and of course the hydrogen ion. These are just some major ones that we deal with. And remember, they're cations because they're positively charged. And some major anions that we deal with include chloride, phosphates. We see this one a lot in DNA, and even carbonates and bicarbonates, but bicarbonates in particular, that's HCO3 minus. These are some major anions that we deal with. So let's talk about how some of these electrolytes are distributed in the body. Starting off with sodium, which again in ionic form is Na+. So sodium is distributed as such. Let's say that you have a cell like this. So this is inside the cell, and then this is the outside of the cell. So inside of the cell, the fluid inside the cell, we call that intracellular fluid. So I'm going to call that ICF. And then the fluid outside of the cell, we call that extracellular fluid. So what happens in the case of sodium is that majority of the sodium that we see in terms of distribution is actually found on the outside of the cell in the extracellular fluid. So it's mostly like a 99% to 1% distribution. So 99% is found on the outside of the cell, and 1% of the ICF, or 1% of the sodium, is in the intracellular space, in the intracellular fluid, the ICF. Sodium is a very important ion because it's involved in a lot of things. For example, when we look at neurons, in order for an electrical impulse to travel through a neuron, sodium has to go into the cell in a process called an action potential. So usually the potential difference across a neuron is that the inside of the neuron is negatively charged and the outside of the neuron is positively charged. This is in no small part due to the action of the sodium-potassium pump. So the sodium-potassium pump. It's like a transmembrane protein that is just like located on the cell membrane of the neuron. Okay, so what that does is that it basically pumps out sodium, 3 sodiums, and then it pumps in 2 potassiums. Okay, and so this is very important because a resting neuron does need to have a potential different, like most of the outside of the cell has to be positively charged and most of the inside has to be negatively charged, just so that when it's time for an action potential to travel, then there will be, a disruption in this distribution of charge. So once an action potential travels through, then the inside becomes slightly positive, the outside becomes slightly more negative, but that's just jumping into a whole other thing. But then just keep in mind that sodium is very important for a lot of action potentials. So if you want to say nerve impulses, that works as well. Okay, and then sodium is also very important, and the reason why is just because of this main electrolytes discussion that we're talking about. There are a lot of things that sodium is used for. However, I'm not going to jump too much into that because I do want to talk about some of the hormones that control sodium levels in our blood and in our body in general. Some of which are aldosterone. Aldosterone, this one basically helps to keep sodium in the body. So it usually acts on the kidneys, and what it does is that it ensures that there is a reabsorption of both sodium and water back into the blood. This is in the kidneys. That is one. And then another hormone is antidiuretic hormone. Remember, when you take a diuretic, you want to pee. So when you want to use antidiuretic hormone, it's going to act against that. It's going to encourage you to pee less. So what does that mean? It will still act on the kidneys, but instead what it does is that it encourages the reabsorption of only water. And what that ends up meaning is that if only water is being absorbed back into the blood, then overall the concentration of sodium will drop because it's getting more diluted. And then finally, there is going to be the AMP hormone. And basically, what that one does is, first of all, it stands for the Atrial Natriuretic hormone. So it's actually produced by the heart, but it still goes and acts on the kidneys once again. And it basically encourages the increased excretion of both sodium and water. So it's like kind of doing the opposite of the work of aldosterone, for example. And so because we're getting rid of water and we're getting rid of sodium, there is a reduction in the sodium level and the sodium blood plasma concentration. Okay. So we do have specific names for when you have too much sodium and when you have too little sodium in your body. And it's fairly easy. Let's talk about it. So if you have excess sodium in your body, then we can call that hypernatremia. Hypernatremia. And that's when you have higher than normal levels of sodium. And you can see that natremia has Na, and sodium's acronym is Na as well. So that's how I remember it's hypernatremia for too much sodium. And then you can also have hyponatremia for when you have too little sodium. Okay. All right. That being said, let's jump into the next ion.